Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 25 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, I got to see your face this week.
Yeah, we had a quick little friend meetup, had a couple drinks together. Some
It,
adult beverages.
it was just so nice to actually be able to see, because, it's been, 2 years since we've seen each other?
Pretty close. Yeah,
Yep,
probably since
almost.
last Hobie,
Right, and that's,
which
oh
is
no,
for anyone who's doesn't know Mike and I personally, is like the youth leadership volunteer organization that we both know each other through. That's how we met.
and
So
actually,
that was
I think it was the New Year's, after that, because we were both at New Year's, right?
we were. You're right.
Yeah, so it's been a year and a half, but even still, that's as long as we ever gone without saying hi to each other. And your
Yeah.
beard is just glorious as it ever
Oh, thank you.
was. And it was just really nice now, as I'm sure many of you out there are experiencing the same kind of thing of slowly re-entering society and
Hopefully,
just
if you are
yeah,
vaccinated.
yes, hopefully. If you're listening to this podcast, you're vaccinated. It's hard for me to imagine the kind of person that would be
You
listening to
would be
this.
kind of surprised.
Oh, would I?
So I actually have a cousin who isn't like opposed to it. He's not an anti-vax or anything, but uh, you know, like many other people in the world, him and his fiance, like they want to have kids at some point, and they have been subject to the misinformation that the vaccines can potentially make you infertile, which is just not true. Like people got pregnant during the trials.
Mm-hmm.
Like the only person that actually had a miscarriage during the trials was a person in the placebo groups that did
Yes.
not get the vaccine. um so obviously that's not true, and I told him, I'm like, I'm a scientist. I'm like, I don't obviously study viruses, but I understand how to read science. And so I kind of just explained it to him, and he's still kind of on the fence about it, but doing your best and just talking to the people in your lives like they're human beings, like they're people, instead of just talking down to them as if you're vaccinated, right? uh because that's not really all that helpful, to people who are like legitimately on the fence about it.
And that's definitely something that I try to do a good job with, but I just get frustrated at some point, and I'm like, all right, if at this point you have made that choice, so be it. So for those of you out there that are still working to convince your friends and family members that that the vaccine is not only real but a miracle of modern science, you are a better person than I am, because I my patience ran rather thin with certain members of I will say my extended family and leave it
Mm,
there.
mm-hmm.
So, but anyways, vaccine talk aside, we have a really interesting episode to go over today. But before we get there, this episode is going to be coming out on June 2nd. So let's take a look at the calendar and what happened this week in science.
Well, also make sure to follow us on Twitter as well. I'm trying to really kind of boost our social media presence.
And the link for that
um
will be down in the description.
It sure will. And I really should just remember our Twitter handle off the top of my head. I don't, so I need to get on Twitter. Hold on. We
And
are at dead podcast underscore. So yes, if you are on the Twitter, please give us a follow. I'm doing my best to actually retweet really cool like science posts from a lot of paleontologists. Only some of whom I've actually met and interacted with, or interacted with in another capacity on the internet. A lot of them are just interesting science people on Twitter. So if you like science and want to, you know, get more familiar with, or at least become aware of some cool people doing, real science, follow us on Twitter and look at our retweets.
it is definitely a worthwhile follow because, hey, it costs you nothing.
Exactly. And you get free science out of it.
Absolutely. And that'll be, once again, of course, in the description of this podcast.
Absolutely. So, yes. Anyway, this week in science, we've got. Do you have a year for us, Mike?
Oh, 2016.
So close. 2015.
Oh, okay.
So, we have June 3rd, so tomorrow, if you're listening to this the day it comes out. The headline is Rapid Draining of Glacial Lakes Explained.
Say it again.
Rapid draining
Draining.
of glacial lakes explained.
Draining of glacial lakes explained. All right,
Yeah,
explain it to me then.
this was a phenomenon that I did not even know was a thing
Mm-hmm.
until reading through this a little earlier. But it says, since 2008, scientists have sought an explanation for the phenomenon known as, quote, sudden draining, unquote, wherein glacial lakes would, seemingly without provocation, suddenly split and send their waters rushing to the ice sheet thousands of feet below. On this day in 2015, a team from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts provided evidence that just prior to the draining, subtle upward pressure from the ice sheet causes the entire lake bed to bulge, crack, and burst apart, draining its entire contents in moments. Whether this phenomenon is a naturally occurring geographical event or is exacerbated by global warming is yet to be proven. So, okay, this is not what I thought they meant by glacial lakes. It seems like they're meaning literal lakes like on the glacier.
Wow.
So like a puddle on the top of a glacier. And by puddle, I mean like a fairly decent sized lake.
Yeah, right.
I kind of assumed that they meant like, so when ice sheets retreat, so in my experience with talking about glacial lakes, it's you know, the glaciers have since retreated and they will sometimes leave just a big block of ice that like eventually sinks into the ground and melts, leaving a lake. That's what a lot of the small lakes in northern New York, where I live, and then also Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. Most of those lakes are glacial lakes that form in that way. So that's where I kind of thought they were going with it, but I guess they're talking about like current glacial lakes. So, all right.
Well, okay. Yeah, I got nothing to add on that.
Yeah, this was the only vaguely geology one for this week, so the pickings were pretty slim here. But
hey, we'll take what we can get. The pickings are not slim for this week's topic, which I had thought we talked about once before, but we sort of glazed on it. We just kind of grazed to the side in one of our other episodes. Gavin, what are we hitting today?
So we are talking about the largest, well, depending on how you count, the second largest group of tetrapods, which, if you remember, tetrapods are basically vertebrates, things with bones on the inside, that live on land. The largest group of tetrapods, besides birds, and that would be lizards. We've talked a lot about different kinds of reptiles before, but we haven't actually talked about lizards themselves. And so the whole origin of me doing this episode, or thinking of that this is something appropriate to do, is I was actually sort of brainstorming a script for a different group of reptiles, and I was like, okay. So I was listening to another podcast about it, and just to sort of get ideas, some talking points that I think I might have wanted to hit about that group. And then they said a scientific name, and it had the word or the suffix saur in it. Saur,
yeah.
or saurus, like dinosaur, which I don't remember off the top of my head if it's Greek or Latin, but I feel like most people might know that means lizard.
Yeah, doesn't dinosaur, isn't it like terrible lizard is the original like the etymology of dinosaur?
It is. Yep, dinosaur means terrible lizard. However, it is an extremely common suffix to add to any kind of extinct reptile.
Really?
Because many dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus, it doesn't even have to be at the end of the word. There's a type of dinosaur called Parasaurolophus, but the saur in Parasaurolophus is spelled that way as well, meaning lizard. However, none of them are lizards. Dinosaurs are not lizards. They are reptiles. They are not lizards. Lizard has an actual definition that does not just mean reptile. So, just for clarification's sake, I thought we'd talk about what actually is a lizard, and more importantly, what is not a lizard?
Okay.
So yeah. So as with a lot of these things, we'll start off with saying, Mike, to you, the layperson, what is a lizard?
Jeez. All right. So, what is a lizard? Um, I feel so. Characteristics of a lizard. I want to say that they have to be, or that they are generally at least cold-blooded. And I know
Okay.
we've talked about how that is, that's not a great term, but like they
Hmm.
generally don't produce their own internal heat.
Right.
Um, although now that I'm thinking about it, I'm gonna stick with that, even though I'm questioning myself.
That is very, very broadly true.
Okay.
Um, and actually, so there's two different sort of terms with that. So there's animals that produce their own heat. So I guess when it comes to producing heat, there are two different kinds. There's endotherms, endo meaning like inside heat. So those are
Right.
things that produce their own heat, mammals, birds, and then ectotherms, so like outside heat, basically everything else. Um, However, there's also you can also talk about it in terms of do they do things to maintain their heat, or do they just kind of fit with whatever the ambient temperature of the air happens to be? So that's homeotherms are the ones that sort of actually have things built into their physiology to maintain a certain temperature. And then there are actually forget the other term opposite of homeotherms. Um, but there are actually many kinds of lizards that are homeotherms, where they do things to maintain a constant temperature that's usually not all that much higher than just the ambient temperature. But like at nighttime, they'll be generally warmer than the air, and during the day, they'll be generally a little cooler than the air.
Okay.
But anyway, the very wonky sort of tangent there. Very broadly, yes, lizards are what most people would call cold blooded. Anyway,
Sure.
sorry.
We'll call
Continue.
it
Continue.
a soft win for me. Um, so I feel like a tail when I think of a lizard is something that is like pretty common. I feel like having four limbs.
Okay.
I feel like four limbs is something that's common when I think of
Mm-hmm.
some sort of a lizard. I'm thinking of like the gecko gecko right now.
Okay. Yep.
I don't even know if the gecko gecko is a lizard, but I'm rolling with
Geckos
it.
are lizards. Yep.
Okay, is the gecko gecko a lizard?
Yep. So from what I can tell, that is, I think the exact species that it is a crimson day gecko.
Crimson day gecko. Okay, I sure. I don't know. I feel like they eat like small bugs and things, or like they would be broadly carnivores. Um, although I am very unsure about that. I'm just spitballing on that one. I don't know exactly. It's another one of those.
You know it
Uh,
when you see it.
right. It's kind of another one of those things where I feel like the more I'm thinking about this, the more things I would be like, there are some wildly different things that I would still consider lizards if I saw them.
Okay. Well, throw out some examples. What are some of those things?
I mean, so I'm not going to know any of their names, but I feel like I've seen lizards in like swamps and ponds. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like while I've never personally been to a desert, I feel like you might see some lizard type things in a desert. I know I've had like friends that have had lizards in some sort of a tank. Um,
Myself included.
right, yeah, exactly. So, and it's one of those things where I'm not sure how much actually binds that group together,
Okay.
other than I feel like they have tails. I feel like again, four limbs, not too big, is always in my head. But again, I don't know how much of that is
Mm-hmm.
just my lack of experience with lizards. So that is, I feel like this is a much broader category than
It
I'm even
is.
thinking with that. Yeah. So go ahead and let me have it.
So lizards are very broadly a term that is applied to things within the order Squamata.
That's a great name, Squamata.
Yes, and I don't actually know the etymology for that. I probably should. Um, let's see. My good old friend Wikipedia. Um, okay, so it is Latin or derived from Latin for having scales.
Okay,
So
so that's probably a big one that I missed.
yeah, that is kind of their whole shtick.
Yeah. Hmm.
So they're like I said, in the order Squamata, However, as we will talk about in a bit, that also includes snakes. Snakes are just real funky lizards.
I believe that.
So for the most part, I will sort of make a distinction at a certain point in the episode where I'm no longer including snakes because they're so weird that they deserve their own episode that we will get to eventually. But until that point, I will say I am including uh, snakes within this group for now. But yeah, so basically
When
things
you
like
said group, I'm sorry. Can you like what taxa specifically are we talking about? I know that that can be a little bit
right.
fungible, like we talked about. But what's
hmm
like what specific taxa are we talking about when you say squamata?
So squamata is an order. It is an order of reptiles.
And that is pretty high up. Doesn't it go like kingdom, phylum, order? Like it's the third from.
Nope,
Again, I
there's
know.
class in between.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
So
So
still
it
pretty
is
high up though.
roughly on the same rank as, let's see, like primates.
Okay.
Yeah, so, but again, being the same rank does not really imply much of anything because there are
Right.
orders of magnitude times, well, I would say like probably like an order of magnitude more species of squamates, which is the term for things in the group squamata, than there are primates. There's give or take probably around 11,000 species of lizards or
Wow.
squamates, I should say. Um, so, which is the makes it the second, most diverse order of all vertebrates, with the exception of perciform fish. So perch-like fish. And granted, the perciform fish are crazy diverse. Like it's really not that close between it being the first and this one being the second. But um, yeah, so it is an order of reptiles. However, as we've sort of talked about, reptile doesn't sort of mean all that much because usually when people say reptiles, they don't mean birds as well. Uh, so we're going to actually sort of break it down in terms that are more scientifically appropriate for the year of our Lord 2021. So,
By all means.
but first, let's actually talk about what makes a lizard within reptiles. So, first, they have a single fused premaxilla. So, a premaxilla is essentially the bone right under your nose that your incisor teeth come out of. In
Okay.
reptiles, almost all reptiles, especially on sort of this side of the reptile family tree, that is not fused. There's typically two of them and they're separate. And I will say, snakes used to have this and lost it. So snakes
They've
no
lost it.
longer have that fusion there. Or at least it is significantly less fused than in their non-snake relatives. They also have a single parietal bone, which is a bone in your skull. So if you basically take your hands and cup them over your skull above your ears, and then sort of like around your temple-ish is where the bottom of your hand should be, like the heel of your hand, and then sort of rotate your hands a little bit back at like a 45-degree angle. That's roughly
Right.
where the parietal bone is. It basically makes up sort of the back top of the skull.
The back top. Okay.
So they have a single one of those instead of two halves on like one on each side. They have reduced nasal bones, which, as you might guess, are the bones sort of around the nose.
Does that just mean like their what would be their nose is kind of depressed into their face?
No, it just means that other bones take up the space that the nasal bones take up in, say, crocodiles or something.
Okay.
They do not have teeth on their vomer, which mammals are weird in that we have a secondary palate. So, like, the roof of your mouth is not made up of the same bones as the roof of a lizard's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
We have a separate airway that goes from our nose through your sinus down. Reptiles, with the exception of crocodilians, don't have that. Instead, the roof of their mouth is made up of a bone called, partially made up of a bone called the vomer, which in humans is in your sinuses, but in most reptiles is the part of the roof of their mouth. Some reptiles have teeth on that, but squamates do not. They also have specialized wrist and ankle joints that are unique to them, obviously with the exception of snakes, who no longer have those. And then they also have, very broadly, this is probably the most important thing that makes a squamate, is that they have a really high degree of cranial kinesis, which means, unlike a mammal, whose skull is very rigid and very solid, uh, squamate skulls just kind of aren't. It's much more flexible. The snakes really take that idea and run with it, where they have basically no joints that are stiff in their skull.
Is there a particular advantage to that?
Yep, it basically just means that you can eat bigger things.
Oh, okay. Oh, is this like where like a snake can like unhinge its jaw?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But it's not just that, but that's the best example of it.
Right, okay.
For example, I have as I sort of alluded to earlier, I have a pet leopard gecko. And when she's just sort of, they lick their lips a lot.
What's her name?
And what?
What's her name?
Her name is Peleus.
Peleus? Oh, Peleus. I would love to know where you picked that name, because I have no idea what it means.
It is the name of a dragon in the Percy Jackson series. I'm kind of a nerd, I'm sorry. Anyway, so when a lot of lizards, when they lick their lips, they actually have a joint that would like in front of their eyes, so between their eyes and their nose. So the top of their mouth kind of can bend up a little bit without the rest of their skull moving. Because when you think of, like, in humans, when you talk, your upper jaw does not move at all. It's only your bottom jaw flapping up and down, essentially. But in squamates, they can do things where move their top jaw relative to, like, the main part of their skull.
I'm now, like, pretending to talk while touching my hands or touching my face and like, it's like, oh yeah, the top of my mouth doesn't move.
It doesn't move.
Huh.
So that is the biggest thing that makes a lizard a lizard. Obviously, there are many, more refined anatomical things, but that is the big send-home message, is that they can move their skulls in a lot of funky ways. So within reptiles, we've sort of talked about, there are two big groups. We talked about this mainly in the reptiles episode quite a while back. I don't actually remember what episode that is, but when it was basically talked about what makes a reptile and why the term reptile is kind of garbage. There are two different large groups of reptiles, at least that are still around today. So there are the archosaurs, which means ruling lizards, even though they are not lizards. Lizards are not in that group. But those are things like your crocodilians. Your dinosaurs are included in that group, and therefore birds are also included in that group. So archosaurs today only have crocodilians and birds, although there's been many, many other past groups in the archosaurs. The opposite side of that are the lepidosaurs, which means scaly lizards, which is much more accurate, and that is where actual lizards are, with their close relatives called the rhynchocephalians, of which there is only one species left today. And it sure looks a heck of a lot like a lizard, but it's actually not a lizard. It's called a tuatara.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah, so if you look it up, that is one of the cases where it looks like a lizard, and it probably looks more like a lizard. It looks much more like a lizard than snakes do. However, it is not a lizard. It is not a squamate.
The first thing that comes to mind when I see this is iguana.
It does look very iguana-like, but it is not at all closely related. It is the closest relative to squamates that we have today, but they are not actually squamates. They're a different order altogether called Rhynchocephalia.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, so the differences are kind of semantic. Basically, rhynchocephalians were much more common back in the day, and I'll kind of circle around to that fact in a little bit here. But they have a lot of the bones in their skulls are in kind of different places relative to actual squamates, which is at least in lizards and reptiles in general, kind of how you tell the difference between some of the larger groups is how big different parts of the skull are, essentially.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's sort of where lizards fall. Is that their closest relatives are tuataras, called part of the large group Rhynchocephalia, and then those two are closely related. Whereas things like crocodilians and birds are most closely related to each other. Those two branches make a bigger branch, and then turtles come off somewhere at the bottom. So that is sort of what the reptile family tree, at least of living reptiles, looks like. However,
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
within Squamata, so we know where Squamata falls relative to the other big groups of reptiles. Within Squamata, it is an absolute hot, stinky mess.
Oh boy. And is this something that like there's no way to avoid it being a hot mess, or did the people who started doing this like really screw it up for everybody else?
Well, I mean, groups can be moved around at this scale. You could just be like, oh, well, we used to think, the iguana family was more closely related to the monitor lizard family, but we realized, later that actually iguanas are more closely related to the gecko family or something like that.
Okay.
So at this scale, you can kind of just move things around based, what the old people did doesn't so much matter other than the names that they gave them.
So if you're telling me that like the taxonomy of squamate are a mess, that like that's not a human thing, that's just like squamate are a mess, it sounds like is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, no, it's a giant mess. And like,
All right.
granted, all things with taxonomy are kind of humans' fault because it's not really like taxonomy is a thing in nature. Like it is. So sort of what we talked about with species last time, where it kind of gets a little philosophical, where it's like nature doesn't organize itself into families. It doesn't organize itself into orders.
Right.
We just call them that because it helps our monkey brain to classify things. So, in that sense, yes, it is humans' fault. However, basically, what groups are more closely related to what other groups, which is a natural thing. We have done historically very poorly at figuring out what groups are more closely related to what other groups within squamates. And the most common question I kind of get when I explain this kind of thing is like, okay, and you've actually brought this up in previous episodes, but like, okay, well, we have all these things here. Why don't we just test their DNA?
Right. That's that as a layperson, it's kind of part of what I think. It's like, yeah, just like look at the DNA, figure out the parts that match, and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Which
However,
of
that
course,
can
yeah.
be kind of misleading for a reason that actually that I like understood but had explained to me in a much simpler way relatively recently. So you would think that two groups. So if you have three groups, the two that are more closely related will have DNA more similar to each other, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So think about it like this. So
I'm
hold
seeing
out your right hand in front of you,
right hand. Palm facing out or palm facing towards me.
palm facing out,
Okay.
and then put down your ring and pinky fingers. So you have three fingers up.
Done.
So imagine this as sort of a branch on the tree of life, where your each finger that you have up, so your thumb, pointer, and middle finger are a branch.
Mm-hmm.
Your based on the way this is shaped, right? You would say that your pointer and middle finger would be more closely related to each other than your thumb.
Right, because they branched off more recently.
Right, exactly. Ideally, if you took a DNA sample from each of those three groups, it would come out this way. The two that are located most closely related or to each other, your pointer and middle finger, would be more genetically similar to each other than either of them are to your thumb.
I'm assuming the punchline here is that that's not the case.
Not always. And what this doesn't really account for is rates of evolution. So, basically, if you go back to the point where your pointer and middle finger were not different, but they were the same, and where that branches off from your thumb, that ancestor, say that breaks off into the two groups that we have. That's sort of the starting point for when those two sort of lines diverged, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So then when you break off from the bigger group there, when your pointer and middle finger break off from each other, say your pointer finger, after those two split, starts evolving much faster than your middle finger.
Mm-hmm.
Given enough
The DNA is
time,
going to change pretty quick. Yep.
given enough time, the DNA from your pointer finger will change so much faster than the DNA from the group represented by your middle finger. So much so that it is so different that it artificially makes your thumb and your ring finger or your middle finger appear to be more similar to each other than your middle finger is to your pointer finger, when in reality they had a more recent common ancestor.
Okay, so this can be. I assume this is still can be a tool if used appropriately, but it's not just like we'd put all the DNA into a computer and just figure out what's closest.
Right. So it is a tool, but it is far from perfect. And that was kind of the hope with once DNA testing became more of a thing, was that this would really sort stuff out, but it really hasn't, just because lizard skeletons are very, very similar to one another, with a couple of exceptions. Okay, well, from this point on, when I say lizard, I mean not snakes. Because snake skeletons are also quite similar to one another, at least, behind their skull. Their skulls are very different from one another, but once you get past a snake's skull, it's all just vertebrae and ribs all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
So, so from this point on, when I say lizards, I am excluding snakes.
Okay.
So, with the exception of things like monitor lizards and iguanas, a lot of them look very similar to one another. And so, morphologically, it can be pretty tough to tell which groups are more closely related to each other, just because they're all so similar. And it can also be, with this new DNA information, because it's not like you can just toss all of it out. It's now data that we have. So we try to use it the best we can, but it honestly just kind of made things worse. So
okay.
this is sort of, I'm going to lay it out real quick because, like I said, this is a very diverse group. So this is going to be real fast and dirty. What groups sort of go together for the current living lizards. And so, like you said, you couldn't really name too many groups of lizards, but you'll probably be familiar with most of these that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, from the original lizard ancestor, when it broke off from the Tuatara group, the first modern group that we still have today to break off were geckos.
Okay.
So, in that sense, geckos are sort of the most primitive, quote unquote, lizards. So, they were the first group to break off. They're kind of doing their own thing. They're not all that closely related to too many other types of lizards.
Right.
After that, we have a group that includes skinks, which is a very large group of lizards.
I swear I have not heard a skink. I have not even heard that word in like a decade. I have to relook this up because I know Yes. Okay.
They're very like tube-like. They're very like sleek. Generally, they're kind of burrowers, so it helps to have kind of a sleek body like that.
Right. I have not heard the term skink in forever.
And then their closest relative is actually a group of lizards that I'm not incredibly familiar with, so let me quickly look up a little more about them. So it is a group called the Chordilidae, which Generally, I think they're called girdled lizards or spiny tail lizards. You see them occasionally in pet stores and things. They're not the most diverse group. There's only a few living species around, so not too many species.
Can you say that one more time? Cordylidae?
Cordylidae. So Cordylidae. So them and the skinks make one group together, or at least are more closely related to one another. And again, all of this is completely subject to change at literally any given moment, just because we have no idea what's happening. After that, we get a bit of a better resolution. So these three next groups tend to generally always come out as pretty close related to one another. But then where this group of the three of them falls, we kind of don't know. So there's a group called the lacertid lizards. Things like collared lizards, generally pretty tropical lizards. This is like sort of your stereotypical lizard outside of geckos. Things, like I said, called collared lizards, or there's a species called the jeweled lacerta, which is very commonly kept as a pet, just
I
because
tried
it's
to
very...
Google this and I got lasered lizard.
But yeah, it's a they're generally very pretty lizards, but they look very stereotypical lizard. Lots and lots of scales. Generally, they're a lot of them are green. They tend to live in pretty tropical areas.
Okay.
So then after that, they are closely related to a group called worm lizards.
Worm lizards. Are you going to tell me that worms are lizards?
No. However, they do look kind of a heck of a lot like worms.
That they do.
But they are actually lizards. So the actual group, this is called Amphisbaenia. So they are most closely related to those lacertid lizards. However, this is the first incident that we've talked about of legless lizards besides snakes, because leglessness has evolved many, many times in the squamates very independently. So this group of lizards did it completely differently than snakes did. They have a different ancestor. So I should say the most recent common ancestor between these worm lizards and snakes had legs. So they acquired leglessness separately from each other.
Is there... I have an idea, but what's the evolutionary advantage? If it's evolved, many times, there's got to be some sort of advantage. And of course, like, evolution doesn't choose things, but
right.
What's the advantage of being legless? I think I could guess, but what?
Well, what do you got?
I imagine it's like a little bit easier to move around in particular types of environments when you are, a long, skinny organism. Like, that's probably way easier than using arms to be able to pull yourself places if you can.
It depends on what you do.
Right.
So
okay. So okay, go on.
I will preface this with, for snakes, to my knowledge, we don't actually really have a good idea on why they did it. For Amphisbaenians, we're pretty sure it's... So all of the Amphisbaenians that are alive today, these worm lizards, are fossorial, meaning that they live underground.
So if they're underground, yeah, okay.
When you don't have arms to sort of... Well, think about how narrow your head is. And then when it gets to your shoulders, it gets pretty wide, right?
Right.
That's much less of a problem if you just don't have arms.
Yeah, and if you're burrowing underground, I imagine you want to be not that wide, especially not that unevenly wide.
Right, because all you have to do is push your head through the dirt, and then you're good to go. The rest of your body is, as thick or thinner than your head. If you can get your head through, you're good to go. And it's likely a similar reason to snakes. The best, or I guess most convincing argument that I've heard for why snakes did it was because it makes it easier to go into rodent burrows.
Easier to go into rodent burrows? Okay. So just co-opting already existing habitats?
Right. So you can make your body bigger, but if you don't have legs, you can still fit through that relatively small hole. So you basically
Mm-hmm.
like min max for girth while using all of that girth for pure muscle, because that's literally all snakes are. It's just a tube of muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so the lacertid lizards and the worm lizards are pretty closely related to one another, and then that group of those two is closely related to the teoid lizards, which are things like your tegus, and several other groups of uh, like South American lizards. Generally pretty big. If you've seen if you've seen a wow, okay, I'm trying to Google and talk at the same time. It's not working. If you've seen a tegu before, you will recognize it. It looks a lot like a monitor lizard with a much shorter neck. They have the same sort of forked tongue. They're generally pretty big lizards. Um, pretty commonly kept as pets too. They're generally much better pets than many monitor lizards.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so those three are pretty close related to one another. Then we get one of the best group names of that I've ever heard in uh, in biology, and it's a group that makes up or that is made up of snakes, um, iguanas, monitor lizards, and some other non-snake legless lizards as well. But this is a group called Toxicophora.
Toxic. Okay, so obvious question here.
Yep.
Are they? I was gonna say toxic, but are they venomous? Are they poisonous? Are
Not all
they?
of them are venomous, but this is where venom is thought to have originated.
Ah, okay.
At least, the very potent kinds of venom that snakes use, because it is kind of arguable that all snakes are technically sort of venomous. Not obviously like medically significant to humans,
Mm-hmm.
but even like a garter snake has some very mild venom that is pretty like effective on things like earthworms, because a lot of garter snakes eat a lot of earthworms, which makes sense.
Right, and the amount of venom needed to kill an earthworm is going to be significantly less than, one that would even do any damage to a human, I take it.
Right. And anybody who's ever been bitten by a snake, even like a garter snake or a milk snake or something like that, probably noticed that like your skin might have like itched a little bit. That is their very, very mild, basically non-existent, but still there, venom. Um, because all venom is, even in things like cobras, is just modified saliva. That's all it is. And all snakes have saliva. So, and this is sort of provided evidence for things like a lot of monitor lizards, things like Komodo dragons, that are we've sort of discovered in the last handful of years are actually venomous. Not
Hmm.
nearly as potently as like a cobra or a rattlesnake, but they do have venom. Um, yeah, so snakes are most closely related to a group that we will talk about at length in a little bit, but I'm not going to spoil that.
Oh boy.
And then that sort of subgroup is related to like a subgroup also made of iguanas, um, and some of their closer relative things like what are members of this group? So Anguimorpha is a sort of large group that includes things like bearded dragons, another very common pet lizard, and then also things such as the frilled lizard, very famous, the ones with the big frill that they can puff out on the side of their neck,
Right.
as well as monitor lizards and things like that, as well as, like I said, a couple other non-snake legless lizards. And again, this complicated mess, that's lizards for you. Those are all the major living groups of lizards. Pretty complicated. It's a giant mess. And I'm sort of reading from one of the most comprehensive papers published about sort of lizard taxonomy from 2018. And even they're like, well, we're only kind of confident that this is right.
is this the kind of thing that has changed? Like our knowledge and understanding of lizards has changed a bunch in the last, number of decades, and likely will continue to change? Or do we think we're starting to get a pretty good handle on, what lizards are, even if they're a mess?
I think we're starting to, because like I said, things like the worm lizards and the lacertid lizards like almost always come out as sort of very closely related to one another. So we know those two make a group, and then we're figuring out where that group goes. So it's
Okay.
basically putting together a puzzle piece where it's like, okay, I have this blue puzzle piece that I know is supposed to be part of the sky, but has nothing else on it. That's kind of what squamate taxonomy is like. It gets even worse once you get into the snakes, because
I can only imagine.
snakes are almost all vertebrae, which typically, the full credit to anyone who actually studies snakes, because they can find the most minute differences in vertebrae, and just from like a single vertebra can be like, oh, this is a member of the boa family, or a member of the python family, because those are different. So full credit to them. And then snakes do all sorts of weird things with their skull. Like I said, we will eventually do a different episode about snakes,
I'm looking
because snakes
forward to
are
that.
so weird and funky. However, part of the reason, and this is true, and I might be partially biased though, because I'm a paleontologist. Part of the reason why we don't have a very good handle on the lizard family tree is because lizard fossil record is honestly really bad.
Say
You
that one
would
more time.
The fossil record of lizards is pretty bad.
The fossil record of lizard. Okay. I mean, I assume this goes back to what we talked about before, like just the environments where they live tend not to fossilize well.
A combination of that, but it's like you said, obviously not all, but there are many kinds of lizards that live in places like deserts,
Mm-hmm.
which can be, generally not, but can be really good for preserving fossils. Um, or also, like you said, swamps. Swamps are excellent places to preserve fossils, and yet we just kind of don't have great lizard fossils. So let's go through some lizard paleontological history. So first, they sort of split from the Tuatara line, so their closest relatives. We thought somewhere around 168 or so million years ago. So sort of like the middle of the Jurassic period.
Mm-hmm. Right.
However, so that was the oldest for sure squamate that fossil that we had. However, as I was sort of talking about with genetic stuff, you can sort of do like a molecular clock where it's like, okay, basically you assume that the rate of evolution is, X, and then you take, a DNA sample from a lizard and from its closest relative, the Tuatara, and you can sort of wind back the clock to say, okay, based on this rate of evolution and how different these two are, their common ancestor should have been however long ago.
Right.
Generally, I don't like that.
And why
It
is
is
that?
it is useful in some cases, but as we've talked about, I think last episode actually, um, so we talked about punctuated equilibrium before, right?
Right.
Which, for anyone who did not happen to listen to that episode, it is essentially the idea that evolution happens in quick bursts, that you'll go a long time without a large amount of change, millions and millions of years. But then all of a sudden there'll be a change in environment, or something else goes extinct that makes whatever particular group you're looking at explode in diversity. And an explosion in diversity typically also means a explosion in differentiating yourself from your close relatives genetically. So a lot of times, a really good example of this sort of failing is, so we know that the closest relative of whales are hippos. However,
Closest relative of whales are hippos.
yes,
Not
closest
like
living
dolphins? Or...
relative, anyway.
Wow, okay.
So, based on the DNA, that split should have happened. I think something like the last time I checked, like 20 or so million years before the oldest hippo we have. So all the genetics people are like, oh, you just need to keep looking and find those fossils. And we're like, we've looked real hard. Those fossils don't exist. We have sediments with fossils from the time you're saying that they should be there, but they're not there. So in that case, the genetics, granted, me being a morphologic, looking at actual bones, not DNA things, paleontologist, there's a bit of bias there. It's important to recognize our biases. But
Always.
this is in my opinion, a rare example of when the genetic stuff and the fossils actually line up. Because in 2018, this paper that I've been referencing, sort of looking at this entire time.
And what is that paper, by the way?
So this is a paper published in Nature in 2018 called The Origin of Squamates Revealed by a Middle Triassic Lizard from the Italian Alps by Tiago Simoes and authors, published in Nature, like I said, in 2018.
Is this the kind of article that we can link in the show notes, or?
No, it is behind a paywall.
Understood.
Unfortunate, but we've also talked about that and why that is as well. You
Go back
can
and listen to that episode.
I will not provide links to this, but if you look around, you can find it. Yeah, if you are so inclined. Anywho,
we'll leave that there.
This paper published a new fossil specimen, like it says in the title, from the Middle Triassic. So for reference, like I said, the previous oldest squamate that we had was from around 170 million years ago. The Middle Triassic is about 230 million years ago. So it pushes it back by like between 60 and 70 million years. That's a good chunk of time.
And it pushes what back? Like what exactly gets pushed back that far?
The oldest squamate fossil that we have.
Understood. Okay. So 60 to 70 million years ago.
So the genetics people said that the common ancestor should have been between tuataras and actual lizards should have been around 240 million years ago or so.
So there seems to be a rather large gap.
There was. Until they found this specimen. Because in the grand scheme of things like 10 million years is especially for the genetics people, is fairly good. Especially for being how long ago it was.
This was like 200 or close to 200 million years, wasn't it?
No, it was so when the genetics people said it should have been was about 240 million years ago. And when the previous oldest was like 168, but they
106. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said just like 60 or 70. Okay.
No.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's still closer.
Right. And then with this paper, from Nature that we just sort of talked about, they found a new specimen that is a squamate, a very, very primitive looking one, from about 250 or so million years ago. So the genetics people actually got one right. So score one for the genetics people. But in general, like I said, it took us this long, and we've been looking for squamates, just because we have them around today. They're not some obscure group. They're literally everywhere. They live on every continent today except for Antarctica. And we have fossils from Antarctica and every other continent, but they're just very, very few and far between. We don't really start seeing good squamate fossils until like the middle to late Cretaceous. So anywhere from like 100 or so to about 66 million years ago is when we start seeing some actually, good, usable squamate fossils. And this is where I talk about that mysterious group that I sort of alluded to earlier that snakes are pretty closely related to.
Right.
There is a very, very common, at least at the time where they were alive, extremely common, and also very commonly used in media these days, group of reptiles. If you've seen Jurassic World, you might be familiar with it. The gigantic sea monster-y thing that eats the big bad dinosaur at the end.
The gigantic sea monster that eats the dinosaur at the end.
Yes. These are called mosasaurs. Very large, completely marine. You know, they were not able to even come on land at all. Reptiles. This is the only case where seeing something big and ancient looking and calling it a lizard is actually true. So mosasaurs sort of evolved at the very beginning of the Cretaceous period, roughly 140 or so million years ago. And then by the end of the Cretaceous, they were everywhere. And they were probably like the dominant animals in their ecosystem. They ranged from close to 50 feet long, rivaling the size of a lot of whales that we have today.
Jeez.
All the way down to 3 or so feet long, smaller than an iguana, And
That's a wild range.
Mm-hmm. They did basically everything you can think of, from being, specialized for catching other fish, specialized for eating other marine reptiles, because they weren't the only big marine reptiles swimming around. They were just the only lizards doing it at the time. To things that had really big, instead of sort of sharp pointy teeth to catch slippery things in the water, such as fish or other marine reptiles. Some had sort of like these big, almost sort of circular teeth that they used to crush like shells and things. Very, very diverse group that was doing extremely well until, very tragically, very suddenly, they did not. At the end of the Cretaceous period.
Okay.
The same extinction that killed the dinosaurs killed them as well.
Of course, that seems like a real...
Mm-hmm.
That was a real bad time.
And you would not know it just by looking at them, but their closest relatives are snakes.
Okay.
So them and snakes shared a common ancestor that had legs, apparently, because mosasaurs have legs. They have flippers. So we'll talk about this much more, I'm sure, in the eventual snakes episode. But there's a very large hypothesis about how snakes, like I said, one thought that I personally think probably makes most sense is following rodents or rodent-like things into burrows. Mm-hmm. There's also a large group of people that thinks that maybe they were aquatic and moving through the water in a very snake-like way is very efficient. And depending on what you do in the water, can get more efficient if you just lose your legs. So
I guess that makes some amount of sense. If you lose your legs and go back to the water, like, why do you need limbs in the water?
Depends on what you do with them. Things like plesiosaurs, the long neck boys, like things that look vaguely like Loch Ness Monster-esque.
Right.
Those didn't use their tails to swim; they used flippers. So they actually had pretty short, stubby tails that probably didn't do all that much. Whereas things like mosasaurs use their tails to swim and their front flippers to steer, mostly. So again, depending on what you do in the water, having limbs can help, or it might make you just more hydrodynamic swimming through the water.
Okay. So it depends, like you said, depends on what you're going to use them for, I guess.
Right. And so because of this relatively poor fossil record in general for squamates, a lot of times the fossil record can really help us figure out what groups go where with a lot of things. However, because the fossil record for these guys is so scarce, it's just not all that helpful. Basically, sort of like we talked about with birds almost. It's like the first time we see something that like looks iguana-y, it's got all the iguana features. So it's not like we don't have good transitions into
Right, they
each
just sort of
group.
appear.
Right. So, and by the end of the Cretaceous period, around 66 or so million years ago, pretty much all of those big groups that I mentioned earlier were kind of around. Snakes were around, but didn't really start diversifying until mammals started taking over because most snakes eat primarily mammals.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, they were around, didn't really start diversifying until after the extinction. And then, in general, most of the modern lizard groups kind of followed suit. Because, kind of as you said, uh, most lizards, or at least many lizards, eat insects. And insects really diversified as well in the latest part of the Cretaceous into the Paleogene after the extinction. Um, and there also are many lizards that are herbivorous, things like iguanas. I think all iguana species are herbivorous. Um, However, they also eat a lot of fruit. And fun fact, fruit also didn't really exist, at least not in the way we think of it today, until the end of the Cretaceous period.
So I was way off when I said that I thought most lizards were carnivores or mostly carnivores, because they ate like flies and small bugs and stuff.
I mean, in general, I'd say more often than not, yeah, you're probably right. I feel like even most, especially younger lizards, will take a bug or two if you give it to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know things like bearded dragons uh, are probably the most common or second most common lizard to keep as a pet. Um, when they're younger, you feed them almost exclusively insects. But then as they
Right.
get older, just because that extra protein and stuff is good for them as they're growing.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they're adults, they transition to eating almost exclusively vegetation.
Huh.
Whereas then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, things like monitor lizards, which eat insects / meat for their entire life.
Hmm.
And so that is a very long, very complicated episode about lizards.
But still, it's nice to have it kind of broken down as to it, like kind of going back to at the beginning when I was guessing what a lizard was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the hardest ones I think I've had to do. For any new listeners, this is a frequent topic where I have no idea what on earth it is we're talking about, and I've got to try to explain it at the beginning. And that was one of the harder ones I had to do, and I guess it kind of makes sense now, knowing just how much of as you say, a mess lizards are. That's kind of to be expected. If lizards are a mess to scientists, then when I'm thinking about them, I left out scales, which was probably an
Mm-hmm.
obvious one, but beyond that, like it kind of makes sense that I was a little bit off with my attempt this week.
Well, that's okay. I mean, sort of like we talked about also when we talked about fish. It's like lizard is such like a ubiquitous term that it's like hard to describe, you know? Um, but a fun fact that actually, I don't know if I had this in my notes, but I meant to talk about it. So the group actually that tuatars are part of, the rhynchocephalians, there's only, like I said, like one species around them today. However, their fossil record is very, very good. We have a very, very good rhynchocephalian fossil record. They were much, much more diverse than squamates were for almost all of the time that both of them have been around. So, fun fact, just because things are diverse and abundant today doesn't mean that they always were. Sometimes they were just kind of kicking around in the background.
And maybe we'll have another mass extinction event, and they won't be so diverse anymore in the future.
Way to end on a low note, Mike.
We do optimism here on I Wish You Were Dead, which is why we named our podcast I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. This has been episode 25 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. Make sure that you look at the forums down in the description if you have a particular topic that you want discussed, or hey, you or somebody that you know is someone that'd be perfect as a guest on our show. Go ahead and fill out those forms. We'd love to have you on, or we'd love to talk about whatever it is that is interesting to you. Gavin, that's all I've got, and I will talk to you again next week.
Absolutely, buddy. See you then.